Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you know that I love to talk about movies that are based on historical events, sometimes praising them for their accuracy and for their depiction of things, but also sometimes we talk about the movies, some of which you're already thinking about in your head right now, that maybe don't just mislead the public, but downright lie about some things. First one that really comes to mind blatantly is, of course, Braveheart. U571 has a lot of that stuff. There's a lot of movies that do that, though. So we're going to take a look at the channel Sideprojects today. That's one of Simon Whistler's babies. And we're going to take a look at the biggest lies from historical movies. The link is in the description, so you can check it out and all of the other content on Sideprojects without my commentary. I want to thank Matthew from Loganville, Virginia. Thank you, Matthew, for your support, especially right now when historic content channels across the board on YouTube are seeing a big reduction in the number of views that they're getting. And I've been hit less than a lot of other people have been, but I have been hit by it as well. It's especially important right now to have that support from folks on Patreon. So thank you, Matthew, for your support. I could not continue to do this without you. Let's dive into this one.
It's well known that any movie that claims to be based on a true story will have been so heavily fictionalized as to be virtually devoid of any truth at all. Even the ridiculous Snakes on a Plane was inspired by real-world events, though the movie shares virtually zero similarities with what actually happened.
I have had it with these monkey-fighting snakes on this Monday to Friday plane!
Although people generally take the statement that if a film is based on a true story with a grain of salt, we all tend to be much less skeptical when it comes to movies about serious historical events. However, these supposedly historical accounts are no less prone to fictionalization than more frivolous stories.
Listen, if you're watching any movie that portrays historic events, just assume that some of it's right and some of it's wrong. And then use that as a catalyst to go find out for yourself. Never take for granted that if it's portrayed a certain way, even if it's one that gets most stuff right, never take for granted that it's all 100% that way. Because even sometimes there are just little things that are different about a story. I've been focused a lot on Masters of the Air, for example, because we just did a tour over in the UK, and it gets most things right, but there's still some stuff that, are just little things that it messes with, just enough that makes you think that everything's true because most of it is. For example, they show the character of Curtis Biddick, who was played by Irish actor Barry Keoghan, and they show him as staying on the plane and not bailing out because his co-pilot is severely wounded and he wants to try and land the plane to get him out. It's not exactly what happened. They were both killed, but what happened was there was a fire behind them in the cockpit to where they couldn't get out. So it wasn't a matter of him staying on intentionally. It was because he could not get off the plane, and that was why he died. So sometimes it's just little things, but then other times it's like these really egregious things, like in Braveheart, portraying William Wallace as dying at the exact same moment as Edward I, or that William Wallace was the father of Edward III, things like that. Just ridiculous.
It's like Cocaine Bear. That's well reported that movies like Gladiator and 300 are full of wild exaggerations and inaccuracies, and they're far from alone. So today we're going to be looking at 3 other movies that claim to be telling important stories from history despite being filled with pretty egregious lies. Allegedly.
Allegedly. Oh yeah, 100%. This one is, you guys know that most of the time I'm pretty forgiving when it comes to historical inaccuracies in movies if I feel like it's entertaining and it leads people to find out the truth of a story. But this one is so egregious that it's just unforgivable in my mind, even though it's got some pretty big name actors in it.
The development of the Enigma machine was of major importance for the Germans leading up to and during World War II. With an estimated 40 to 50,000 of these machines having been manufactured, possibly even more, it gave the German military and spies the ability to easily send and receive messages using complex ciphers that would be difficult for the Allied forces to decode. Best of all, because the encryption and decryption was performed by the machine, anybody could still communicate in these coded messages without needing to have any knowledge of cryptography. Needless to say, cracking Enigma was a high priority for the Allied forces. Being able to decrypt the Germans' messages would give them a serious tactical advantage, as they could prepare for whatever movements were being planned and discussed.
And of course, a lot of people are familiar with the Enigma story because of the movie about Alan Turing, The Imitation Game, but as is true with scientific advancement in general, there's no one single person responsible. And in this case, decrypting Enigma was a multinational project involving a lot of people, and Alan Turing was just one of those people.
This desire to crack the Enigma code is where the movie U-571 comes in. The movie stars a number of award-winning actors and also
including John Bon Jovi,
the crew of US Navy submarine S-33. In the film, which was set in 1942, the German submarine U-571 was damaged during the Battle of the Atlantic. American intelligence intercepted the submarine's distress call, and they disguised S-33 to look like a German resupply U-boat so that the crew could board the German sub and steal their Enigma machine. It was a daring mission, resulting in numerous casualties and both submarines being sunk, but the Americans successfully escaped the sinking of U-571 with the Enigma machine, and their life raft was eventually spotted by a US Navy plane. Thus concluded the story of how a group of American submariners risked their lives to capture an Enigma machine and
it was the
Allies
British
change the course of the war. And while U-571 and S-33 were real submarines, absolutely none of this ever happened. The story's very loosely based on the events of Operation Primrose, when the British destroyer HMS Bulldog boarded German sub U-110. The crew took pretty much everything that wasn't bolted down off the submarine, which included the Enigma machine. However, that wasn't even the most important thing that they were able to salvage. Polish mathematicians had spent years studying the codes and actually...
There you go. See, people always forget about the Polish involvement. Like I said, this was a multinational, multi-tiered, multi-layered project to unravel the mysteries of Enigma. And you had the naval encryption, you had regular encryption, all of this stuff. So, tells little parts of the story. But yeah, I just don't understand why they had to make this into an American crew. It's no less compelling if it involves a British crew.
Had some success in deciphering a number of them. In the 1930s, they were even able to reverse engineer an Enigma machine based on the intelligence that they had gathered. Now, Germany responded by increasing the complexity of the machines, but the Polish experts had already shown that the key to deciphering the messages wasn't the machine itself, but rather the code book that instructed users on how to set the machine each day. In simplified terms, the Enigma machine could only be used to decode messages if someone had a list of the daily passwords. And it was the code book containing those passwords that was the most important item retrieved by the crew of the HMS Bulldog. Most importantly, the code book and Enigma machine were taken from U-110 on May the 9th, 1941, 7 months before the United States even entered the war. There were 15 times...
But still, we could have had a submarine that did all that, right? Yeah, U-571 is... Of course, I don't know anybody who actually thinks U-571 is real history, but then again, I mostly interact with people who have a decent level of historical understanding, so maybe there are people out there who think that is true.
Where Enigma machines, codebooks, and related materials were captured throughout World War II, and 13 of those were done by British forces. The US Navy only seized one, and it was in 1944, long after the machines had already been cracked.
Well, it was a British ship that grabbed an Enigma machine from a German submarine, not an American sub, but... who cares about history?
Not only were World War II historians outraged by the rewriting of history, but so too were the British. Members of Parliament, as well as Prime Minister Tony Blair, all spoke out against the movie, which they saw as Americans disrespecting their military and taking credit for England's successes in the war.
That said, I have to believe the filmmakers would have anticipated that was going to happen, right? And I wonder if they figured, you know what, bad publicity is better than no publicity. And so if you're getting the Prime Minister and Parliament in the UK to talk about your movie, is it really a bad thing? I don't know. I'm just kind of speculating out loud here.
To smooth things over, President Bill Clinton wrote a letter to a member of Parliament acknowledging the role of the Royal Navy in the HMS Orbracia, the ship that fired the initial depth charges at U-110, which ultimately allowed the crew of the HMS Bulldog to board the vessel and capture its contents. Though this letter is often referred to as an apology, Clinton emphasized that the movie was just a work of fiction. But to many, the biggest affront was not the movie's attempt to rewrite history, but rather what came at the end of the film. Just before the end credits, a postscript said that the movie was dedicated to the bravery of Allied sailors and officers who risked their lives capturing Enigma machines from U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic. It went on to specifically mention the HMS Bulldog and the date of Operation Primrose, even though the movie itself seemed to have pretended that they never existed.
So I don't know what people have a problem. Like, did I hear that right? He said that people were upset about that? Because that seems like at least it makes it a little less horrible that they acknowledge that at the end. Oh, here comes Braveheart.
For many people, the movie Braveheart is the only way they ever learned anything about the First War of Scottish Independence.
And that's fair, and this is why I've been rather less upset about Braveheart than a lot of people are. Because I believe that it did lead a lot of people. I didn't know anything about William Wallace before Braveheart. I didn't know much about Scotland even having a war of independence. Now, of course, Braveheart, if you go to Scotland, they will tell you Braveheart is not William Wallace, it's Robert the Bruce. And they really kind of see Robert the Bruce as every bit the hero that William Wallace was.
This is a shame, because virtually nothing about the movie is accurate other than the use of long spears.
I wouldn't say virtually nothing about the movie is accurate. I would say a lot of stuff is inaccurate. I mean, they didn't wear kilts. Obviously, all the stuff with William Wallace fathering a child with Queen Isabella, stuff like that.
Many scathing and hilarious reviews regarding the historical inaccuracies, but perhaps the best came from author John O'Farrell. In his book, An Utterly Impartial History of Britain, he wrote that Braveheart couldn't possibly have been more inaccurate. Not even if a plasticine dog was added to the cast and the movie was renamed William Wallace and Gromit.
We'll go somewhere where there's cheese.
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I don't think it's as awful as that.
If the brutal reviews from historians were not enough, Braveheart also has the unfortunate distinction of being regarded as one of the most historically inaccurate movies of all time, as well as one of the worst movies to ever win the Academy Award for Best Picture.
Now you're going too far. Listen, worst movies to ever win Academy Award for Best Picture? Have you looked at the list? All right, you know what? We're going to look at the list. All right, let's just look at the ones that won around the time that Braveheart did, okay? So we've got some good ones in here. I mean, Dances with Wolves, everybody seems to praise that one. I thought it was meh. Silence of the Lambs, of course, is fantastic. Unforgiven, fantastic movie. Schindler's List, Forrest Gump, Braveheart, The English Patient. Ugh. Titanic was good. You know, Shakespeare in Love. I remember liking it at the time, but since then, ugh. American Beauty is one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. And that won Best Picture. I mean, I watched that movie twice and just felt like I had wasted my life. Gladiator, of course, is fantastic. Beautiful Mind, I've actually never seen. Chicago, it's a good musical. Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. $1 Million Baby was decent, but not Braveheart. I mean, it's way better. Braveheart's better, way better than that. Crash, The Departed was good. No Country for Old Men, some people love, some don't. But then, I mean, King's Speech is fantastic, but then some of these, The Artist, Argo, Spotlight, Moonlight, The Shape of Water, Green Book. Ugh, come on. I mean, start reading through the list on your own time. Nomadland, Coda, Everything Everywhere at Once. Some of these movies were just unwatchable. And you're going to tell me Braveheart was like the worst movie to ever win Best Picture? Come on. Even if you just accept that all the history was bad, it's a fantastic movie from an entertainment perspective.
So, where did this all go wrong? Well, the short answer is, well, everywhere, and the list of inaccuracies is far too long for this video. We will of course go over some of the highlights, but the first place where Braveheart faltered was with his choice of source material. The screenplay was written by Randall Wallace, who said that the epic poem The Acts and Deeds of Sir William Wallace, Knight of Ellerslie by Blind Harry was his major inspiration for the film. Unfortunately, Blind Harry has a reputation among historians for being completely full of shit. In fact, we don't even know if he was really blind. Harry's poem was written over 170 years after Wallace's death, and his narrative about Wallace is contradicted by all of the contemporary sources.
But again, did Wallace argue that he was basing it on what he thought was actual history? Or did he just think that this story by Blind Harry made a really good tale, a really good story? Kind of like the Robin Hood stories do, right? I mean, if he was looking at a 170-year after the fact source as a source of entertainment, I get that.
He claimed to have based his poem on a book by Wallace's childhood friend, Father John Blair, though nobody else has ever seen this book, and it is widely believed to have just never existed. So with all of that said, if Braveheart was merely based on Blind Harry's poem, as the screenwriter said, it would be more forgivable. At least it would have been based on a historical account,
right,
even if it was a historical account that was already regarded as being wildly inaccurate. However, much of what is depicted in the movie appears in neither Blind Harry's poem or anywhere else in the historical record.
So basically they're starting with Blind Harry's poem and then they're saying, how can we embellish this? How can we make this more Hollywood?
And the movie diverges from reality right at the start. Wallace is depicted as being from a family of poor farmers, and his father and older brother leave him at home as a small child when they have to go and fight the English who are occupying Scotland. In reality, Wallace was the son of a nobleman,
Yep.
as things didn't get violent with the English until he was already 22 years old.
All 100% true. And and those are kinds of things, some of the stuff that they do in historic movies, I understand for the sake of the story, but other stuff, it's like, it doesn't make it less compelling to change that. Like, it doesn't make it less compelling that William Wallace comes from a noble family. In fact, you could argue it's more compelling because he was risking more as a nobleman by siding against the English, because he had wealth and property and land and inheritance that he was risking losing by siding with the wrong side.
There was also the love affair between Wallace and Isabella of France following the Battle of Falkirk.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
It is even implied that her son, Edward III, was fathered by Wallace rather than King Edward II.
There's no reason whatsoever to include that in the story. It added nothing to the entertainment value of the story at all.
None of this would have been possible because Isabella was only 3 years old and in France during the Battle of Falkirk, 13 years old when Wallace died, and 20 when Edward III was born. Robert the Bruce is also depicted in the movie as betraying Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk, though this never happened. Like many other noblemen at the time, Robert owned land in both Scotland and England.
Yep.
While this did cause him and other nobles to switch sides multiple times during the early days of the war, there was never any betrayal as depicted in the movie. At the time,
Right, it was well known which side Bruce was on at that point.
Battle of Falkirk, Robert was not fighting with or actively supporting either side of the war. Robert was a keen strategist with a legitimate claim to the Scottish throne, and as such, he would have seen no benefit in actively betraying Wallace.
Right.
What about Braveheart's big fight scene?
And that's another one for me where there just didn't feel like any good reason to have Robert the Bruce betraying Wallace there. It didn't add anything to the story.
Battle of Stirling Bridge. It was
with
a
no
pivotal
bridge.
fight in the war, and a massive win for the Scottish, who routed the English despite being vastly outnumbered. However, it was nothing like Braveheart depicted it. To start, their outfits are completely wrong. The blue face paint was something that had been seen by the Romans on tribes in Scotland.
Yeah, it's funny how they take the blue face paint like the Picts used 1,000 years before this, and then they add to it the kilt, which come a couple hundred years later, and they use those two things for the Scots of the 13th and 14th century.
1,000 years earlier, and kilts weren't worn until 500 years later. Now, fashion aside, the Battle of Stirling Bridge is likely the most egregious.
I don't think it was 500 years later. I think maybe 200 or 300 years, about 300 years later.
Accuracy in all of Braveheart, most noticeably because of the distinct lack of a bridge in the movie. This is a problem because the bridge was the entire point of the battle, and the reason why the
1,000%,
Scottish
yes.
army.
That's one of my biggest complaints about the movie. They could have actually, it would have made a really compelling story to show Stirling Bridge as it actually happened instead of the way they show it.
Was able to defeat a much larger force. Stirling Bridge was very narrow, only wide enough to allow soldiers to cross it in rows 3 men wide. It was the safest means of passage across the river, but it would take hours for the entire force to cross the river. In a plan allegedly devised not by Wallace, but by fellow commander Andrew de Moray, who is completely absent from the film, the Scottish army waited until a substantial amount of English soldiers had crossed the bridge. It had to be a small enough force that they were confident they would easily win, but large enough to make a meaningful impact. After an estimated 2,000 or so English troops had crossed the bridge, the Scottish army launched a surprise attack with their spearmen charging down at the bridge from the high ground. The English attempted a counter-attack, but the Scots were able to quickly fend off the charging cavalry with their spears before advancing quickly upon the English soldiers in the bridge, causing them to retreat. Some sources state that the added weight of the fleeing soldiers caused the bridge to collapse and drown much of the English force, while others say that the Earl of Surrey ordered the bridge to be destroyed as part of the retreat. Either way, the bridge was both the location and the most important tactical feature of the battle, yet Braveheart chose to just have a full-on melee in an open field in the middle of nowhere,
which completely takes away the reason why Scotland won that battle, their strategy behind it, and it just looks like it's just a big, let's charge at each other and see what happens.
Represent this pivotal moment in the war.
This one I know less about, but another Best Picture film right there.
The 2012 film Argo is based on the true story of the rescue of 6 American diplomats during the Iran hostage crisis. Following the Iranian Revolution of 1979, President Jimmy Carter granted the deposed Shah medical asylum.
Happy birthday, President Carter. 100 years
in
old.
the US while he underwent cancer treatment. Many Iranians were outraged with the US over this, and on November 4th, 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking the diplomats as hostages and attempting to force the US to turn the Shah over to stand trial. Only 6 diplomats evaded capture, and the movie focuses on their exfiltration from Iran. The general premise of the movie is accurate. CIA disguise and exfiltration expert Tony Mendez conceived a plan to smuggle the 6 diplomats out of the country by having them pose as a film crew who were scouting locations for an upcoming science fiction movie titled Argo. It was meant to be a movie adaptation of a novel titled Lord of Light, a movie that had actually already been planned. While the real movie had been abandoned after funds were embezzled from production, it still provided a complete and elaborate cover story. There was already a full screenplay written for the film, as well as some concept art from legendary comic book artist Jack Kirby.
So one of the best things about a good cover story, right, is that it does just enough of realism to make it plausible. So taking a movie that it was actually really being worked on, even though it had been abandoned, with a script and everything, it gives you a great cover story that has just enough plausibility to it.
Most importantly, the original sci-fi novel was set on a desert planet with a Middle Eastern feel, so scouting Iran for filming locations made a lot of sense. That said, there are a lot of factual inaccuracies in the 2012 film, though many of them can be forgiven. Some of the information is only known to be false thanks to...
So if some of them can, or many of them can be forgiven, why are we listing this as one of the biggest lies from historical films?
CIA documents that weren't declassified until after the movie was released, and some of it was clearly artistic license for purposes of making a more entertaining movie. For example, the movie ends with the diplomats barely escaping after a dramatic chase scene in which the plane is shot at while leaving Iran. The movie also had President Carter calling off the mission at the last moment, forcing Mendez to go ahead with the plan on his own. None of this...
Those kinds of things I totally get for the sake of making a compelling story and giving it drama. Those are the kinds of things you have to do, because a lot of times if you told the real story the way it really went, it would be kind of boring and deflating. I can forgive that kind of stuff.
This happened, and while the diplomats did have to hide and lay low in Iran for 79 days, they were never in any imminent danger. In reality, they all left on early morning flights out of Tehran without incident or suspicion. That's not really cinematic, so we can understand why the decision was made to make it more dramatic for the big screen. There were other small changes as well, such as depicting the diplomats as being hesitant to go along with the ruse of pretending to be a movie crew. This was likely to create some feeling of tension in the audience, but the truth is honestly more entertaining. The diplomats were told of 3 possible exfiltration plans, and they were all immediately on board with the idea of pretending to be a movie crew. As one of the diplomats later recounted, the plan made perfect sense because who besides a bunch of Hollywood arseholes would have the gall to travel to Tehran for some sightseeing in the middle of a revolution? However, there's one glaring problem with the movie that can't really be excused as artistic license. In the movie, the escape is orchestrated by the CIA, and they are pretty much given full credit for the mission. The diplomats were hiding in the home of Ken Taylor, the
I think I know where he's going with this. Wasn't it the Canadians who were heavily involved in this?
Canadian ambassador to Iran, but the movie significantly downplays his role. In fact, the original postscript text for the movie said that the CIA let Taylor take credit for the rescue for political purposes, further downplaying Canada's role in the operation. This was an interesting choice, as this rescue effort was known as the Canadian Caper.
And listen, Canadians, I know we got a lot of Canadian fans of the channel here, and you hear me say this all the time, and I will say it again. When it comes down to it, when we're talking about life on the line, there's nobody I trust more than the Canadians. Looking at what they did in World War I and World War II, you do not mess with Canadians when life is on the line. Oh my gosh, nobody's better.
When the diplomats arrived back in the United States, cheering crowds held signs that said, "Thank you, Canada," on them. Although the initial idea did come from Mendez, President Carter stated that 90% of the planning and execution was done by the Canadians. In an interview, Carter stated that Ambassador Taylor was the main hero of the operation. Following a screening of Argo at the 2012 Toronto International Film Festival and the considerable criticism it received, director Ben Affleck changed the postscript text to basically split credit for the mission 50-50 between the CIA and Canada, though this was still...
Don't you understand? Hollywood is in the United States. Therefore, anything Hollywood makes is going to be American-centric. I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that's kind of how it ends up happening. They're making these very often primarily for an American audience. But again, I mean, I think you're being a little bit insulting to an audience when you think that we would find the story less compelling if we knew that it was done by the Canadians and not by the US CIA. It makes no difference to me who did it if it's a great story.
Seen as downplaying Canada's role. The film also falsely claimed, or at least very heavily implied, that the British and New Zealand embassies refused to help the American diplomats. The diplomats had originally been hosted by the British embassy, but the location was deemed unsafe, so they went to stay at the homes of Canadian officials. The New Zealand embassy also set up locations for the Americans to hide in if they needed to be moved again, although this never became necessary. New Zealanders were outraged over this mischaracterization of their embassy, and on March the 12th, 2013, they decided to take action. By unanimous vote of the New Zealand House of Representatives, Ben Affleck was officially censored by the government for the unfair and inaccurate portrayal of New Zealand in Argo. And we're absolutely sure that both he and Mel Gibson think about the people they offended with these movies every night while polishing their Oscars.
While polishing their Oscars. I don't know. That seems a bit much to actually censor Ben Affleck because of that. I get it. It's all PR. It's all about making sure people understand the truth. And if it takes passing a vote to censor him to get the truth out there or whatever, I don't know. What do you think? What are the most egregious lies from movies that portray themselves as being historic that you can think of that should be on a list like this? Let me know in the comment section below. And I do want to give a shout out and a thank you to Brian in Chesterton, Indiana, and Robert in Coal City, Illinois. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. If you want to learn about how you can become a supporter on Patreon, the link is down in the description, as well as in the pinned comment. You'll see links to the upcoming tours that you can be a part of with me and a bunch of our friends. Thanks for watching.